Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about memorization for law students, everyone's favorite topic. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan, that's me, and Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together, we're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about memorization, everyone's favorite topic. Depending on your professors in law school, you may face closed book exams in law school. I hope you do, because I have like this thing about all these open book exams. It really makes me angry.
I almost never had a closed book exam, and that really did not serve me well in the bar.
I know. So if you have a closed book exam, that means that you have to keep all the information you need to know in your head, and that's a lot of information.
It is.
Yeah, but if you want to complain about it, think about the bar exam, which is definitely
a lot of topics.
A lot more information. But even if you have open book exams, you probably still need to try and memorize a lot of the law. Is this true, Alison?
I do think that's true. I mean, like I said, almost all. I think I had one closed book evidence multiple choice part exam my very final semester, but every other exam I had in law school was open book. And so I think sometimes people got lulled into this false sense of security with that, in that they thought, oh, I can just look things up. I don't really need to know the law that well. But the reality is you're so time pressured that you don't need to be, you can't really be looking up the elements of a test that you need to apply in most cases. I mean, maybe if it's something you really forgot or a really weird thing, whatever. Mm-hmm. But kind of the core information, all of it needs to be in your head in a way you can use, just like on a closed book exam.
Right. I mean, I think an open book exam, you want to think of that outline as more of just a quick reference, not being able to hunt for things.
Right. You don't want to look up the law,
right?
Generally speaking.
No time for that.
If you find yourself flipping through your outline, or one case I remember in property, I was literally flipping through, I think, a commercial outline looking for law. That is not a good scenario to be in.
No,
definitely
that is not.
Not.
I remember when I was studying for one of my first closed book exams, somebody told me that everyone will basically have the law memorized when you walk into class. And I thought, there's no way. If I have the law memorized, I will be out ahead of, so many people. And that is totally not true. I think that most people will have the basics of the law memorized. And so, it's not just that you need to know the gist of the law. You need to know it, fresh in your head in an organized way that you can spit it out quickly using terms of art. You really need to basically be a walking outline, which I think is a little bit different than a lot of people have studied before in the past. I noticed in law school, a lot of people who had science degrees did really well first semester because they started studying for closed book exams just like they studied for science exams, where you also have to memorize a lot of information.
It's literally like, what is this chemical reaction going to result in? If you're taking second semester of Orgo and you have hundreds, thousands probably. I did not do well in second semester Orgo because that is not my skill set.
Yeah. And I was a psych and media studies major, so I never took exams like that in college. So it is a learning curve, I think, to have to memorize in this way. And a lot of law students come from a liberal arts background, and this is really foreign to them.
Yeah, and I think one critical point, before we get into really specifics, is that you really have to learn the law before you can memorize it. And I think this goes to your point. I remember you have a story, from your mother talking to you when you were taking your first set of exams, where you realized that you really had not learned the law in the level of detail that you were going to need to memorize.
Right. I mean, I knew the gist of the law, and apparently the gist, it's not apparently. The gist is not enough.
Yeah, so luckily Lee has two parents who are lawyers, so her mother came to Thanksgiving and said, oh, how's your studying for torts going? And Lee said, oh, it's going well. And then she asked you to recall something, and you were kind of stumbling through, and she's like, yeah, that's not good enough.
No, not good enough. And so, so it was a fun Thanksgiving for me, but it was an eye-opening moment because I realized the level of detail that I needed to start really studying at. And, and I think I was able to kind of dive in and fix that problem. But a lot of folks don't learn that lesson until after they've gotten disappointing grades.
Right, exactly. We talk to a lot of people about what happened on their first semester exams, and they say things like, well, I missed some issues. Maybe my analysis wasn't deep enough. And it's like, well, that was probably because you didn't actually learn the law element by element and go through it step by step.
Yep.
Because if you did, you're much less likely to miss issues. And typically your analysis is going to be pretty good because you're walking through it step by step.
Yep.
So, when you think about memorization, it can be easy to get overwhelmed, but I think you also need to think about it in terms of how are you studying? Are you making useful reference materials that you at least have a possibility of memorizing later?
Right.
So you might want attack plans that are covering the key points once you've studied a topic versus some huge, long 100-page treatise that covers every single detail that you covered in class, but you're not ever going to be able to learn and memorize that.
And I think those 100-page treatise outlines are one of the most common mistakes that we see with new law students because they're literally impossible to memorize.
Yeah, unless you have a photographic memory, and even then you probably still shouldn't try to do it.
Yeah. And I think then even if you have an open book exam, someone might say, well, but I need this 100-page outline. Well, maybe it's nice to have it in your notebook, but
there's bring it with you. You don't look at it.
That you're going to be able to dive into that.
No, I would bring 100-page outlines that someone else had prepared, in a previous class because that wasn't really how I studied, but I did bring them to open book exams for reference, and I had tagged them up and I made an index and that kind of thing. And there were a couple of cases where it did save me on certain parts of a question, but having an index that I could turn to and be like, what is the rule for adverse possession or something that just totally I did not remember, but not very often.
Yeah.
That was not the core of what I was doing on an exam.
All right. So let's talk about some strategies and pitfalls for remembering what you need to know on these exams.
Yeah, and one word of caution here. I think sometimes people want to throw out the things that have really worked for them in the past because they think this is so different, but this is really not a totally different ball game, right?
Absolutely. So I made this very common mistake on the bar exam because everyone talked about how they had all these flashcards for the bar exam.
Flashcards.
I know. And they were doing flashcards in the bathroom, and they were doing flashcards in line at Starbucks, and they were doing flashcards everywhere. And so
it gives me anxiety just thinking about flipping through that stack at Starbucks.
Yeah. So I have really never liked flashcards. Back in the day when I would study for spelling tests and have flashcards, I've always hated flashcards. And so I sat down and was like, I guess I need to make bar flashcards. And so I made hundreds of these bar flashcards for real property and maybe one other class. And then I tried to use them and they did not work. And I realized that one of the ways that I learn and memorize material is I kind of need to have it anchored in some sort of organization. So it didn't work for me to just have these be random factoids. They needed to be kind of random facts that were part of something. So I needed to, memorize what one type of easement was by memorizing all the different types of easements together and memorizing what was different about them. That's just how my brain worked when I was kind of categorizing and memorizing this law. Flashcards, unless you do them in a very distinct way, do not lend themselves to that.
No, they're very kind of atomatized.
Right. And so it just really wasn't the most efficient way for me to study. So those were all wasted hours. I think I just recycled all the flashcards.
Maybe you learned a little bit.
I may have learned a little bit by making them, but probably not the best use of my time.
Yeah. So if flashcards work for you, great. If they don't work for you, you don't need to use them.
Yep.
All right. Well, let's talk about some more interesting kind of evidence-based memorization techniques that we've been looking at recently. The first one is a concept called immersion. And this is kind of similar to the idea that the best way to learn a new language is to immerse yourself in a community where you have to speak that language.
How'd that work for you in Mexico?
It probably would have worked a lot better if people spoke to me less in English, but it did work pretty well. I eventually picked up Spanish. But I do think if I'd gone to a place where nobody spoke to me in English, I would have learned Spanish a lot faster.
Yeah.
The reality is you can't really learn a new language from a book. And this is the problem with a lot of classes and language schools and, colleges and things is they just give you kind of the grammar and, okay, fine, you can conjugate the verbs properly, but you can't actually speak.
Right.
So, immersion really tries to get you engaged from a lot of different angles. And you can actually apply this to learning any type of new concept. So here, as a law student, you can think of kind of surrounding yourself with this concept or idea that you're working on. And one of my roommates actually would do something sort of similar, I think, just instinctively. She would have her study group come over and they would take over an entire wall of her bedroom with paper and literally draw out basically the entire class on this piece of paper. And then she would live with it. So whenever she woke up, she saw this piece of paper and, it was huge. It literally was like wall-sized flow charts. It was crazy. It was like one of the most insane things I've ever seen, actually. But, you can think about what kind of stimuli you can surround yourself with that may help you memorize this material.
Yeah. I had some friends who had whiteboards in their houses and would put law up on the whiteboards so they could see it from the kitchen, or they use those big Post-it note papers that you and I used to use all the time.
Love those.
We did love those. We haven't used those in a long time.
No, you can buy these enormous, go to like Office Depot or Staples, you can get this enormous Post-it note that's it's a poster size. And you can write, say you're trying to learn like hearsay exceptions. Well, there are 18 of them or something? You probably need to know all of them. So you could write those and put them up in your bathroom or put them up in your kitchen, someplace that you spend a lot of time, and you're just kind of start absorbing this information. And sometimes too, it can be spatial. So there's also like the chambers for memory palace ideas. And, the way that people used to memorize things when they were storytellers traveling around was really through spatial thinking, so they would imagine themselves walking into a room and seeing certain things, and then they knew that was part of the oral story. And, people learned a lot of stuff. I think the Iliad, the Odyssey, those were all oral traditions, no?
Yeah, I know.
They're long. They're long.
Really long.
A lot of things going on, a lot of people, a lot of names.
Yep.
Somebody had to memorize all that for us to actually be able to read it.
Yep, that is true, and pass it down, and somebody else, I'm sure
so
who knows what the original Iliad and the Odyssey were, but
right, but they were basically telling them around campfires, but somebody had to remember all those details. So you can apply the same thing. You could also do it almost as an oral tradition. Say you record yourself saying the exceptions and the rules. We definitely have had students do this very successfully. And this might sound really boring, but you can play it while you're cooking.
Yeah, some students find listening to their own voice talk to themselves can be very helpful. And sometimes that can be even better than listening to another recorded lecture, because the benefit of, let's say, you recording yourself, reading your outlines, is that you're then hearing the same material that you've been studying in other ways. Because I think one of the things that can happen is, let's say you're studying for a torts exam, because we've been talking about torts. And let's say you get some other lecture that maybe a friend who was studying for the bar had a torts lecture or something like that. So you're like, oh, I'll listen to this torts discussion. So you listen to it, but they're using slightly different language than your class used. They're covering law that wasn't in your class. And so you might be hearing some of the concepts, but I don't know that that's going to really help you internalize what you need to know for your exam, because it's going to be slightly off. And I think that confusion doesn't help clarify. That's not really immersion in these concepts. That's just kind of, I think it could actually like push you off base.
Yeah, I think too, with a lot of this stuff, the best way to memorize material is to use it. So if you create an outline that makes sense to you and then you read it, that alone is going to be, is going to get you pretty far down the pathway to having memorized it, versus someone who just listens to someone else telling them what the law is. It's the difference between reading a book and writing a book. If you write your own book, basically, you're much more likely to remember that.
Yeah.
I could tell you, some of the details of papers I wrote in college or something. I guarantee you I could not tell you the same information that I got from a book.
Yes, that's true. I could totally tell you about my senior thesis.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And occasionally I've been asked about it in interviews, which is really weird.
Your senior thesis in college?
Literally. Yeah,
Was it
clerkship
illegal?
interview. No, it had nothing to do with the law. Yeah, I remember a clerkship interview, someone asked me and they wanted to talk about the details of it. And I was like, wow, this is really
been
far
out
back.
Of high school or college for a long time.
Yeah, but fair enough. It was on my resume.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I don't think I included the title of my thesis.
Well, mine was like an honors thesis. So
was mine. I just left it off.
Yeah. It was semi-relevant to law, but not exactly. No. Anyway, we can talk about that in a different podcast.
I was like, I don't know what your thesis was on. Now I want to know.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, actually. It turned out to be really relevant. Anyway, moving on. Yeah, so one of the good things about immersion is it's pretty simple to try. So if this sounds interesting to you, you can easily record yourself reading some stuff and listen to it, see if it helps. And you can, get your giant poster board, write your hearsay exceptions, put them in the kitchen, and, see if you memorize them.
And maybe talking to friends, having friends over, talking through some of this stuff over dinner.
Yeah.
So you could like have your board up in the kitchen with your outline. Then you can like be listening to yourself read your outlines. And then you can have a friend over for dinner and you can review the outline together over the dinner you've been cooking when you've been immersing yourself in this law. Doesn't that sound fun?
Sounds better than flashcards.
It definitely sounds better than flashcards. True. All right.
But hey, if flashcards work for you.
Yeah, no judgment.
No judgment. Use them.
Yeah. All right. What else? What are some other techniques?
Well, this one, I mean, it's a little weird name. Not sure we're pronouncing it correctly, but is an interesting concept. So most people probably heard of mnemonics, which is, you take like the letters and make them into some weird thing you can remember. This is a similar concept called acrostics. Acoustics?
I was going to totally make you do this one because I didn't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, we read about this. We did not listen to a podcast on it. Anyway, the basic gist of it is you take the first letter of each word that you need to memorize. So say, for example, it might be hearsay exceptions, or we're going to talk about one in a minute about excuse of performance in contract law. So, why did you not perform? And you mirror these letters instead of with just another letter, you make them into the first letter of each word in a sentence that you can remember.
So is this different than a mnemonic? I thought this was basically what a mnemonic was.
I think a mnemonic is more just like RGB or Roy G. Biv.
Right. So you're just taking
Roy G. Biv is basically red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet.
Right.
So you're just taking the words and compressing the first letters. Here instead, for example, say we're going to talk about excuse of performance in contract law. So that would involve, these are the things you need to memorize: mistake, impossibility, impracticability, frustration of purpose, rescission, accord, and satisfaction. So the mnemonic might be something like
I was like
which is that's fine. However, you could also do something that maybe is a little bit easier, saying, for example, most icy igloos feel really awful.
Okay.
So you're like, oh, okay, that actually might be helpful to me because I can remember, it had something to do with Eskimos. Oh, the igloo, right. Okay, most icy igloos feel, it would be cold in there. They feel really awful. So the idea here is kind of giving you more context to remember those letters.
Right. And some people even do little songs with some of this stuff too.
Yeah.
Like put it to a little rhythm.
Yeah, and sometimes you see this in bar prep courses and things. I think, again, they're probably going to be more effective if you come up with them. And it's also, we're all kind of nerdy. We're law students, but it can make studying a little bit more fun.
Right.
If it's something that makes you laugh, it's probably going to be easier to remember, and might also make you happier if you're like, oh yeah, that igloo, right, I remember, oh yeah, right, okay, mistake, impossibility, impracticability, frustration and purpose, rescission, accord, and satisfaction. So you can kind of see, I think this could actually be very effective.
Yeah.
Yeah, or if you're looking at defenses to strict liability and tort, which would be misuse, alteration, or assumption of risk. So MAA. So our mnemonic would be Ma. Personally, I would probably do something about a cow here, but the example we're using is my alien arrives.
That's true.
So, you can imagine, again, this alien is arriving. Maybe you have a little rocket ship in your head. And it doesn't, it's completely nonsensical. It has nothing to do with the underlying things that you're trying to learn. But you're probably going to remember that rocket ship, and that might make you think of the alien. And then you're like, oh, my alien arrives. Okay. Misuse, alteration, assumption of risk. It's a little bit like, have you ever heard that British concept of rhyming slang?
No.
Really interesting. Look it up sometime. But basically it's slang that that it seems completely nonsensical, but what they're saying is actually a rhyme of what the underlying thing is about.
Huh.
Yeah, pretty weird.
Rhyming slang? That's what it's called?
Rhyming slang is very interesting. Because, if you don't know where it came from, it literally makes no sense.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that before.
Yeah, another example. So you're trying to remember, say, the considerations in a case or controversy analysis, where you need standing, mootness, ripeness, political question, abstention, adequate and independent state grounds. So these are pretty dry, kind of boring.
Right.
But, here's one that somebody came up with. Some moms rap pretty admirable adages.
Yeah, that's not bad.
You could probably remember that.
Yeah. Also, I think that sometimes if you're putting together these sentences, if you want to give them a little more grounding, you can either choose a topic or something that will link it back to that type of law. So I think in contracts, law would be a good example. If you were doing law and one of the cases around this was about cows, maybe you're...
The famous contract cow case.
Yes.
Can't split the cow.
Can't split the cow. But maybe you can even make up, your sentence to link to cows so you can remember, right, what was my, sentence about cows.
Yeah. So I think, they can be completely nonsensical and just kind of funny and have fun with it, or it could be something that's a little bit more linked to the concepts. But regardless, I mean, this is kind of like when we have watched the sketchy law videos. You think they're kind of funny and silly, and you're like, oh, that was kind of fun. And then you find yourself thinking about them the next day.
Yeah.
And you realize, wow, this is actually very effective.
Yep.
So I will be thinking about, my alien arriving probably as I'm falling asleep tonight.
Well, especially I was reading about space travel this morning.
Oh, there you go.
So I was learning all about traveling to the moon and the Saturn and
Sat-5 rockets.
Sat-5 rockets and I forgot the name of the ship that landed on the moon.
Oh, yeah, like a lunar lander thing.
Yeah, the lunar lander that had a... Anyway.
Yes, you could use those, for completely unrelated purposes.
Yep.
So if they're concepts you're trying to remember, it could be hearsay exceptions, maybe like all the degrees of murder and manslaughter and these kind of things. Give it a shot. Why not? Seems pretty effective to me. And hey, there's evidence.
Yeah, exactly. So what about visualization? I think that's something that many people have heard of.
Yeah, so I think, sometimes people get very caught up in this, I can only write stuff in law school because that's what I'm going to have to do on the final exam. But I was a visual learner, and I did all kinds of things that did not involve writing to study. I mean, obviously, I couldn't draw a picture on my final exam, but I could when I was learning and studying things. So,
and on your scratch paper, if you needed to.
Yeah, that's true. I could, exactly. I could draw my rocket ship.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, sometimes you can think about different ways. And I mentioned earlier the chambers for a memory palace. This is something that has a very, very long history. So, you can do this in 2 dimensions, maybe just putting something on a page and, you connect them, or you do a diagram or something like that. Or you can do it in kind of 3 dimensions and imagine walking through a space, and there you can, assign certain things, certain objects in the room to concepts that you need to remember, things like this. I mean, you can imagine if you're trying to do something about, say, agency relationships or something, you can imagine like an object in the room, and then you walk it across and then something happens. It doesn't really matter. This is going to be super personal, but it is definitely something to think about if you feel like you're kind of banging your head against the wall trying to memorize all of this text information. You are allowed to use visuals.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. And nobody knows how you memorize this stuff, just that you can spit it out.
Yeah, and again, it's actually pretty effective. We mentioned sketchy law. If you are a visual thinker, this is a great option for you because they do sort of little videos. And again, they've done them for you, so it might not be quite as effective as if you made your own video, but you're not going to do that. So I think theirs are actually... and because it's a video, it's almost kinesthetic as well. So I think if you are someone who's struggling with a lot of the text-based stuff, this might be a good place to look.
Yeah, and you can, like you said, I think it's worth playing with what resonates with you. So is it this story of walking into a room and seeing pictures on the wall that relate to things? Is it drawing the picture of something or drawing a shape and assigning words to or concepts to each, point in a shape? Or,
yeah, maybe you have a hexagon and you move around the hexagon, and that's how you map out, whatever it is.
I remember trying to learn a bunch of the state capitals by drawing a boat, and I had all these state capitals on these different parts of the boat. It's funny, I don't remember exactly how it looked, but I have this image in my head of this boat with all the state capitals written on them.
Well, that's actually very effective if you remember that. I don't know, I'm trying to remember any state capital. Sacramento, that one I can do.
I was the one close to here.
I'm if Sacramento is, sitting on the steering wheel of the boat, whatever that's called. I don't think it's called a steering wheel, but my boat knowledge is limited. You're going to be, you're much more likely to remember, Sacramento is sitting up there. Maybe Raleigh, North Carolina, I can get that one, is on the prow of the boat. And you think, you start imagining the Titanic scene. Well, this actually gets us into our next idea, which is storylining. since now I'm, riffing on Titanic.
So storylining is a memorization technique in which you take words to trigger your memory for a particular topic and string them together in a story with a predictable progression. This is also known as narrative memorization. So it's pretty easy to understand, but it takes more time to execute than some of the other techniques. But I think this is interesting because different people can retain stories better than they can other facts. Like I can really retain a story.
Well, most people can. Human beings are basically, our brains are designed to work with stories. So, stories can have emotional context, but, here you can make, again, almost like the, acrostics, what are the one we're not pronouncing?
The one that's like a mnemonic, but not a mnemonic.
Exactly. The sentence like mnemonic. These can make more time, but they can also make things more fun. So if you're staying more engaged with the material, then it's probably going to make it easier for you to keep studying. And the thing is, once you have these, you're probably going to remember them.
Mm-hmm. So here's an example. So let's say you're trying to remember that contract formation requires offer, acceptance, and consideration, and you like Game of Thrones.
Oh, that would not be me.
No, but Game of Thrones is coming back. So this is very timely.
Okay, well,
Final
other people
season,
like it.
Final season. It's like, I think it's marked in big red letters somewhere on a calendar in my house. So Tyrion Lannister offered me some wine before the battle for the Iron Throne. I considered taking him up on that. Wine is delicious after all. But then I decided that I shouldn't drink any. I had to accept that it was time for the final battle, but hopefully I won't contract any illnesses. So if you were reading this, you could see that, maybe if you wrote something like this down, that these keywords are kind of highlighted for you. But that way you could remember in this story that you're looking for offer, acceptance, and consideration. And that is what is necessary to make a contract.
Yeah, exactly. They don't have to be super complicated. For example, say you're trying to remember the test for whether someone's pre-Miranda statement should be excluded. You could do something like the custodial keyword. Staff at my school interrogated keyword the students about who started the food fight. Mm-hmm. So again, there it's a story. You're thinking like, oh, the kids are fighting. Oh, the custodian came and interrogated them. Oh, custodial interrogation. Got it.
Yep. So, I think these are just another way to engage your brain. And one of the things I would be thinking about, especially if you're a new law student, is going through these and maybe early on in the finals period, or if you're getting ready to study for midterms, or you're kind of getting ready to study for some of your first exams, maybe take a few bits of law and try these different ones if you've never done some of this stuff before, because I bet it's going to quickly come out for you which ones really resonate with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. The last technique that we're going to run through today is one that we talk about a lot, which is the importance of handwriting.
Yeah, I think for people who are trying to memorize, and this was one I think you said you used a lot.
I did.
Just writing things over and over and over by hand. You can imagine Bart Simpson writing on the chalkboard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great visual there.
Yeah.
Do you think... I don't think there are anywhere he's writing legal concepts, though.
No.
But there is memorization value to handwriting because the spatial associations that come with handwriting things triggers different parts of your brain than simply listening to a lecture or reading something off a page.
Or typing.
Typing.
Typing and handwriting to me are so different.
Yeah, and I think a lot of folks, will say when they're making those 100-page outlines that, I typed all this 100-page outline, but I don't think I'm alone in this. Like, I'm one of those people where it's like I send an email and I can't remember what was in the email.
No, I feel like typing to me is almost kind of like when you get in your car on the highway and you start driving and, you just kind of, like you're there, but you're just kind of zoned out. And then, if you're on the 5 or something in Central California for 3 straight hours, it's a straight road. There's
my whole childhood right there.
Nothing going on. Mm-hmm. And literally there'd be times where I'd be like, I think I just arrived in LA and I have no memory of the last 2 hours.
You didn't miss much. Harris Ranch, some cows.
Yeah, I'm like, I remember that there was like a stockyard that made me vegetarian, but yeah, other than that, yeah, so I think that is kind of, for me at least, typing, like you said, you can type something and just have literally no memory of it seconds later.
No memory. Yeah. So, I think that a lot of people are hesitant because they feel that their handwriting is terrible or that they are so much more efficient on the computer. But this isn't really about efficiency.
No,
this is about cognitive retention. And so you want to slow down and, do whatever works through your brain. So for me, what I started doing in law school is I would kind of have these longer outlines where I'd compile this information, but then I would pare them down by hand and do kind of a handwritten version. And the other thing that I love about handwriting is you cannot be overly verbose when you're handwriting, because you have to self-edit or else you'll just drive yourself mad.
Right. And that was one of the things I was going to return to on this point is this is a great way to force yourself to really learn the material in a way that you're going to be able to rapidly reproduce in an efficient manner on the exam. Because once you find yourself trying to handwrite for the third time some concept that actually doesn't really seem all that important to you at that point, you're going to drop it. And that's good.
Yep. Exactly.
That is a good idea.
That is a good idea. Paring down is good.
Yeah. So it's going to force you basically to get this material down to something that you have an actual shot at memorizing.
Yeah. So I had these legal pads that I used to do these kind of outlines on, and then I would put the outlines in a binder, and that really worked for me. Those were something I was able to memorize, and then I would just practice handwriting sections of those until I would get that down on paper. I mean, it's not glorious. It's not super fun. You don't feel super cool sitting in the reading room at the library, handwriting stuff out over and over again. But, you know, when you get an A, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And then also, you know, in addition to handwriting the elements of the law, you could even think about, okay, now I've made all my sentences, which I just love that concept. So then you need to memorize those. So you can memorize writing those down. And that's probably going to reduce the amount you have to actually write by like a factor of 10.
Yeah. So I think the one piece to all of this memorization is that when you are getting ready for the exam, you do have to practice, you know, taking whatever memorization technique that you have used and turning it into kind of a rapid reproduction on the page.
Right. It can't just become about aliens. You know, you need to be thinking about like, oh, that was actually about this. So sometimes people will even like reproduce these on scratch paper if it makes you feel better. I mean, to be honest, that's kind of a crutch because obviously it's in your head if you're able to write it down. But if it makes you feel better, you can take a couple minutes and do it pops.
But sometimes if I had a mnemonic or one of our sentence mnemonics, because now I'm never going to say that name out loud ever again. But I could have something like, you know, I would put like AAMAR or something like that. And then I could check them off as I talked about them.
Yeah, which I think is valid. Basically, you're recreating what the kind of like 1 to 2 page outline attack plan sheet that you would bring into a closed book exam, which you should make that.
Yeah.
That you would bring into an open book exam for a closed book exam, because I think it is valid sometimes to have a checklist just to make sure in the heat of the moment you are thinking of everything.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we are out of time, but that's a lot of stuff people can try.
Yeah, lots of ideas here. So try it out, see how it works. Let us know what you think. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app, because we would really appreciate it, as long as you're nice. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.